I don't know, but I'm thinking probably maybe 19.
You think she was that old?
Maybe not. I don't know. She might have been younger, but we really don't know. She's pretty. I think she's kind of naive at this point. Anybody think she was younger?
I do.
Okay. How old?
14.
Okay.
14.
Well,
Wow.
Jerry Lee Lewis, didn't he marry his 14-year-old cousin or something? All right. Wasn't he the king? Or no, he was the killer. That's a killer. Anyway, the experience that they underwent included 6 months of beauty treatments that involved exfoliation and moisturizing. You women are probably familiar with that. With imported aromatic oil of myrrh, and then another 6 months of treatment with a variety of spices and cosmetics. And then after sex with the king, or I would say more accurately after being raped by the king, the women are moved to a second harem where they wait to be summoned again. This 12-month regimen was known literally as the Law of Women. Alexander Raleigh, the 19th century commentator, says, now just look at that picture of Persian female life of the highest kind. Persia, the mistress of civilization at the time, the seat of wealth and splendor, the land of the brave and the wise. And this is how it treats its noblest women? Could female degradation be more complete? So here is Esther. She's being prepared for a night of sensual indulgence with the king, a king to whom she is not married, keep in mind. And this is a direct violation of the Torah. And you wonder, how does a nice Jewish girl wind up here? I want to read from Karen Job's commentary. She did her PhD, her doctoral dissertation on the book of Esther. She says, perhaps Esther hated her circumstances with all her heart. Perhaps she felt that life in the harem violated every conviction and moral principle Mordecai had instilled in her. Maybe she wondered how God could have let such a horrible thing happen to her. On the other hand, perhaps Esther loved life in the harem. Perhaps the sensuality of harem life appealed to a part of her nature. Perhaps she was swept off her feet by the attention of the most powerful man in the empire. Maybe she knew that her lifestyle violated the Torah, but didn't really care. Maybe she thought that this was the best thing that ever happened to her. Would such an attitude have pleased God? Was Esther in God's will or out of it? And, some women just really crave that kind of attention, don't they? Years ago when I was teaching high school, I had a young woman, and she was very, very pretty. You may have heard of her. Her name was Sharika Adams. Does that ring a bell? Does the name Ray Caruth ring a bell? He was a wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers. Anyway, when she was in high school, she was dating Larry Johnson, who was with the Hornets, basketball player out of UNLV. And she was attracted to these guys, and they were attracted to her. Well, what happened was she became kind of an exotic dancer after high school, and she got pregnant by Ray Caruth, and he had her murdered. He just, I think he recently got out of jail. But you may have read about that in Sports Illustrated, or it made all the national news. This is probably about a quarter century ago. But this was a young lady I had in my class for 2 years. And I remember I used to drive her to play. We used to do plays in our class, and this was actually before I met her, but I would pick her up and take her to the plays, because she would get extra credit for, we would do this on Sunday, and I'd have like 50, 60 students we would go to plays with the Charlotte Repertory Theater. But anyway, she was kind of caught up in that kind of life. And some girls are. You know, to them it's glamorous. I don't think she thought that getting pregnant and getting killed was very glamorous. Anyway, what Esther did is an egregious violation of the Old Testament standard. She spent a night in the bed of a pagan king to whom she is not married. Now, before you judge Esther, I believe that her culpability is a bit ambiguous here, don't you think? Some medieval Jewish interpreters believe that Esther's night with the king was tantamount to rape, and that even if she had resisted, it might have cost her her life. Others believe that she should have resisted, even if it cost her her life. Now, obviously, there are no easy answers, are there, to a question like this? And this may be more than you bargained for when you came into this class. But I think that this is something that we need to talk about. You know, what's a nice Jewish girl doing here? The narrator makes no judgments. But I think everything is ambiguous in this book. However, as Karen Jobes, as I just read, says, it is certain that this young Jewish virgin apparently did whatever it took to please a lascivious pagan king. So, whether she was 13, 14, 18, 21, I don't know. She knew how to please him.
Well, wasn't the idea to please him so that she would become the queen?
Yeah.
And that she would be his wife?
Yeah. But she's having sex outside of marriage now. You know, today, we kind of, you know, we don't even look down upon that anymore in society. Now, in the church we do. But you probably have people in your family who are living together out of wedlock.
But she's also a young woman who is doing what her guardian is telling her to do. And that's what...
Good point. I'm glad you're here, raising points like that. Yeah, I understand. I understand. I'm not making judgments. I'm raising issues. Now, the text tells us that Xerxes made Esther queen, but the writer seems to carefully avoid the word marriage. It doesn't say anything about them getting married. It says that she was made queen. However, I think it's implied. Now, keep in mind that intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles was becoming a very hot-button issue among the Jews who had returned to Jerusalem right about this time. In the book of Ezra, any of you study the book of Ezra anytime? The people who had intermarried were publicly shamed. There's even a list, a hall of shame, so to speak, in chapter 10. And the book of Ezra concludes all of these had married foreign women. Some of them had children by these wives. And when Ezra wrote that, he was not commending them. Now, back in Ezra, chapter 9 of Ezra prays to God. Who has Ezra 9, 13 through 15?
I do.
Would you read that, please?
What has happened to us is a result of our evil deeds and our great guilt. And yet, our God, you have punished us less than our sins deserve, and have given us a remnant like this. Shall we then break your commands again and intermarry with the peoples who commit such detestable practices? Would you not be angry enough with us to destroy us, leaving us no remnant or survivor? Lord, the God of Israel, you are righteous. You are left this day as a remnant. Here we are before you in our guilt, though because of it, not one of us can stand in your presence.
Okay, that was Ezra 9, verses 13 through 15. And we have similar prohibitions in the church about believers marrying non-believers. You're not supposed to do it. When I was a pastor, back many years ago, I had people come to me wanting to be unequally yoked. And Amos said, can two walk together except they be agreed? And Paul unequivocally condemns interfaith marriage, a believer to a non-believer. Now, the case of Esther is really just the other side of the coin, isn't it? A Jewish woman marrying a pagan Gentile man, but it's the same thing in concept. Now, we're not told what was going on in the mind of Esther at this time. It really would be nice if we could, wouldn't it? Do you think perhaps she hated her circumstances with all of her heart? We're not told. Perhaps she felt that life in the harem violated every conviction and moral code that Mordecai had taught her. Maybe she was wondering how such a horrible thing could have happened to her. Now, on the other hand, maybe she liked living in the harem. I wouldn't mind living in the lap of luxury. But nobody's asked me to. And I don't know how I would respond anyway. But she was certainly pampered, wasn't she? Xerxes spared no expense to prepare his women for one night in bed. For 12 months they were lotioned and perfumed. Spices and fragrant oils were a major export of Persia, India, and Arabia, and they were used liberally by the wealthy and the powerful. Is it at all possible that the sensuality and glamour of such a life would have appealed to her? Is it possible that she was swept off her feet by the attention of the most powerful man in the empire? And sometimes I wonder, what was going through Monica Lewinsky's mind? President of the United States. Was she swept off her feet? Was she manipulative? What? We don't know, do we? All we know is that Bill Clinton did not have sex with that woman.
I saw an interview on her. She didn't see anything wrong with that. And just recently, because she's like 40 now, somebody was saying, well, that was wrong, and he was in different power. And she was like, well, maybe. So.
Wow. The way they justify it.
Well,
Xerxes was the most powerful man in the empire.
In the known world.
Bill Clinton was the most powerful man in the free world. So, when you get some attention from someone like that, but is it possible that she knew that her lifestyle violated the Torah, but didn't really care? Now, the fact of the matter is, a lot of Christians get involved in all kinds of sinful behavior, and they don't seem to care. So before you judge Esther, think about some of the people around you. I'm not saying in this class, but maybe in your church, in your family. And then again, maybe Esther thought that this was the best thing that ever happened to her. We don't know. The simple fact is we don't know the answers to all these questions because we're simply not told. And we might ask ourselves, was Esther in the will of God or out of the will of God? Now, Esther's marriage to a Gentile king has long been a very troublesome moral problem for Jewish interpreters because it so clearly violates the Torah's prohibition of intermarriage. Deuteronomy 7:3, who has that?
I do. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore swore to your ancestors that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. I'm not on the right part, am I?
I don't think so.
No. Let's go back to 7:3. Here we go. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. That's 7:3.
Okay, that's what I wanted. Now, considering the way that Ezra reacted to the intermarriage back in Jerusalem, and considering Ezra's stance on Jewish and pagan intermarriage, I'm just throwing this out. How do you think Ezra would have responded to the situation with Esther?
I think he would be very dissatisfied, very disheartened
Okay.
with her conduct and
Okay.
participation in this.
And also Mordecai too, because
He's behind it too.
yeah, he was behind it. Remember I told you that this book is filled with ambiguity? Are you seeing that? How do you think Ezra would have responded? Well, some interpreters have exonerated Esther, seeing her marriage to Xerxes as an event beyond her control, and therefore not a true marriage. They say that after spending a night with him, the only virtuous thing to do would have been to marry him. Now, I think we need to keep in mind that this argument would have been lost on Ezra. Some would see Esther's marriage to Xerxes as the lesser of two evils, and in spite of the sin involved, led to the greater good for God's people. Now, I don't know about you, but this comes dangerously close to saying that the end justifies the means. How do we use the example of Esther as a positive example of a virtuous woman today? Well, what some commentators over the centuries have done is to conclude that her life in the harem was not a violation of God's dietary and moral laws. Unfortunately, the text does not commend her obedience to those laws the way that the writer of Daniel commended Daniel. Remember Daniel? He refused to eat the rich foods of Babylon. In other words, Esther did not rise to her high position as queen by obedience to the law of God. Daniel did. Two examples. Daniel obeyed the law of God even while in Babylon. Now, there was an old saying, you probably heard it, what happens in Babylon stays in Babylon. But Daniel strictly adhered to the Torah laws. And then Joseph is another example. You'll recall that Joseph in Egypt refused the sexual advances of Potiphar's wife, and he spent years in an Egyptian prison as a result. And by the way, Egyptian prisons in those days did not have television sets and basketball courts and barbells and dumbbells. You see prisons sometimes, on TV, and they seem like they're almost like country clubs, and you don't have to work or anything, 3 square meals a day. Well, the fact that the author of the book of Esther doesn't even comment on the morality of Esther's situation makes it impossible to use Esther as either a positive role model or a negative one. Now, how would you use this episode from the life of Esther to teach virtue to your teenage daughter as she stands on the threshold of womanhood?
If she abstained, it would have made a tremendous statement.
Yeah.
Because that's the way, according to the Bible, you're supposed to conduct yourself.
What message would your teenage daughter get? How old is your daughter?
Annie's 21.
She's married?
No, she's a senior in college.
Well, there you go.
It's hard to tell kids nowadays.
What would you extrapolate from this? Tell her.
Well,
Okay, we're not putting you on the spot.
I know, but I was gonna say, maybe there's sexism and kind of all this too, because you figure David and Solomon did the exact same thing as Xerxes did. They had jillions of, harems and all that. And then you have Abraham and Hagar, and then after that whole thing, then Abraham gets 10 wives or something, after that whole Hagar-Sarah thing. So you're kind of like,
And then you have Ezra.
I look at it like God set the scene here. That if Esther hadn't have been an orphan, God brought Esther as an orphan to Mordecai into the court there, where, there she was, in one of the women that the king, could choose. And to me, God set that scene because God wanted her to be queen, because God wanted her to be able to help the Jews.
Okay.
That, and so when she has to go through the business of going to bed with the king, maybe, we don't know this, but I think she's probably praying and saying, what do I do, Lord? What do I do? What should I do? And that God is leading her because he set the scene.
Okay.
I connect the both.
How many of you had teenage daughters? Anybody? Did you ever teach your children to use your body to get what you want, make yourself attractive as possible to lure powerful men? Probably not. Use your body to advance the kingdom of God. The end justifies the means. This is difficult. The entire situation screams at us moral ambiguity. And I don't have any answers.
So my thought is, since we already know that this book is not about Esther, it's about what God's doing, that maybe focusing on something like more women's morality or something, and since it's not spoken in Esther's book, that God wasn't wanting us to focus on that. He was wanting us to focus on something else entirely.
And again, the author doesn't make any moral judgments.
Right, so God's not wanting us to go there.
Yeah, he doesn't, the writer does not make value judgments, and he does not let us come to simple answers when we consider Esther's life in light of Scripture. Now, keep in mind that we live in what some might call a morally ambiguous fallen world, where sometimes the right course of action is not always clear. And I think it's really easy for us to look at the lives of other people, as perfect as we are, and make judgments thinking that we know what is clearly right and what is wrong. And we often think that if we were in their shoes, we would do such and such a thing, right? We would make such and such a decision. And we believe that God would give us the wisdom to do the right thing and the moral strength to do it. And I can say that I have always done that in my life. I've always made the right decision. Okay, I'm lying. It's easy to talk about ethical and moral issues in the abstract. But life's decisions are not always theoretical, and life isn't always neat and tidy. There comes a day when we find ourselves in a situation where right and wrong are not clearly defined. And every choice that we make seems to have a troubling mixture of good and bad. You ever been there? Been there, done that? How do you respond when your granddaughter gets pregnant out of wedlock and she decides to marry the father who is a Muslim? What do you say? How do you respond? What is right and what is clearly wrong? See, there's a lot of application in this book, isn't there? It really is. Now, Esther may have looked back on this episode of her life with shame and regret, or she may have looked back on it with a clear conscience, knowing that she acted wisely as she knew how at the time. The fact is, we all have such episodes in our lives. I look back, and I've talked to Tess sometimes. I say, gee, I wish I had been a better father. And she says, I think you did the best you could with what you had at the time, imperfect as that is. I want to read for you from Marion Taylor, The Story of God Bible Commentary. I want to read what she has to say here. In presenting us with an ever more detailed portrait of a self-indulgent king whose needs are met at the expense of others, this chapter reminds us that the Bible does not hide the dark side of life. The plan to find a new queen who was better than Vashti involved the elaborate preparation of young virgins for sex with the king. Although many commentators glamorize Esther's Cinderella-like rags to riches story and imagine that all girls want to be queen, it is important to pause and reflect upon the sexual violence of the voiceless girls herded into the king's harem, where they were cared for by men whose boyhood castration signified another form of sexual violation. Any thoughts? Okay. Let's move on to verse 19 through 23. Mordecai uncovers a conspiracy. Now, Mordecai happened to overhear a plot to assassinate Xerxes while he was sitting at the king's gate. Now, I don't know about you, but when you hear he was sitting at the king's gate, if you're like I am, you might think, well, gee, what's he doing sitting around? Why doesn't he get a job? This sounds to me like he was just a loafer sitting around because he didn't have anything better to do. However, sitting at the king's gate actually meant that he held an official position in the court. Now, I don't know what you think of when you think of the word gate, but whatever you're thinking, you need to maybe reconsider what you're thinking. Because the gate leading into the palace complex was actually a large building in which legal, civil, and commercial business was transacted. It would function largely like a city hall would today. The King's Gate at Susa was built by Darius, who was the father of Xerxes, by the way. And it's been excavated and measured 131 by 92 feet. That's a big gate, isn't it? This gate was a large building consisting of a central hall that led into a royal compound with two rectangular side rooms, which I don't know if they were meeting rooms or whatever. The central hall was supported by 4 columns with trilingual inscriptions on the base. They read, Xerxes the king says, by the grace of Ahura Mazda, the gate Darius the king made, he who was my father. And Ahura Mazda was one of the big kings of the Persian Empire. Now, Mordecai overhears this plot, and he foils the assassination plot by reporting it to Queen Esther, who in turn reports it to Xerxes, giving credit to Mordecai. And all of this was recorded in the annals of the king. Now, acts of loyalty were usually rewarded immediately and generously by Persian kings. But Mordecai's reward was somehow apparently overlooked. I don't know why, but it was. And so that is why when Haman is honored in the next chapter, chapter 3, it's so surprising. What would we have expected at this point? What would you have expected? You would have expected Mordecai to have been so honored, right? Haman just kind of comes out of the blue. Who is this Haman? Now, apparently, Xerxes was not a very popular king. Remember what we said last week? He had sex with some of the wives of his advisors. Now, I don't know about today, but back then that would kind of tick some husbands off, wouldn't it? Herodotus, remember the Greek historian, also reports that there was another assassination attempt a few years later in 465 BC that was successful. Xerxes was assassinated in his bedroom by these advisors in his cabinet. So I guess they were really upset by the fact that he, took their wives. Anyway, after the truth of the report was verified, the conspirators were publicly executed by being attached to a tree or a wooden pole. The NIV translates this as being hanged on gallows. But I think a better translation is they were impaled on poles. Because the word hanged implies the use of a rope around the neck. But at this time in history, this was not something that was done in the ancient world. Okay, now of course, in the Old West, they hanged horse thieves, didn't they? The horse thief was like, that was your mode of transportation. That was like stealing a car today. But anyway, I think they were impaled. Yeah.
Bob, it's great. Do you think this Mordecai situation here is part of the comedic?
Yes, I absolutely do. I believe it is part of the comedic effect here. And you're going to see this throughout the book. So in chapter 3, we come to the rise of Haman. So we have in chapter 3 the introduction of a new character who becomes the villain of the story. Xerxes had promoted Haman to a high position. Now we're not told who Haman was. We don't get any kind of backstory. We're not told why this was done. And we have no idea why he deserves such an honor. But we would have expected Mordecai to have been honored. But instead, Haman is introduced, giving the story, Gordon, an unexpected plot twist. So,
An irony, I guess.
very ironic.
Which is comedic.
Yeah, this is comedic and it's ironic. Irony and reversals of fortune are throughout this book. Another one is, Haman builds a gallows to hang Mordecai, and guess what? He himself is hoisted on his own petard, so to speak. Now, a sub-theme of the story is the conflict between Mordecai and Haman. We're told that all the officials at the king's gate bowed down and paid honor to Haman because the king had commanded it. All except Mordecai. Now, why he refused to do this is unexplained, like so much else in this book. In fact, I'm pretty much making up stuff, aren't I? Trying to teach this book, because we just don't know the answers to a lot of things. I'm raising more questions than I'm answering them, aren't I? I don't have a lot of answers, but I do have a lot of questions. Now, let me just tell you this. In the ancient world, kneeling or prostrating yourself or bowing down symbolized deference, respect, allegiance, and sometimes even worship. The Jews in Persia would have regularly shown respect to Xerxes and other superiors by bowing down or even kneeling. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down before Nebuchadnezzar's image in the book of Daniel, remember? What was their reward for this? They were thrown into the fiery furnace. And some of the early interpreters named idolatry as the reason that Mordecai refused to bow down before Haman. However, I don't think that Xerxes would have allowed Haman to be worshipped like a god. Xerxes, yes, but not Haman. Now, again, a lot is not explained in this story. What possible reasons could there be for Mordecai to disobey a direct order from the king? Let me give you some of the possible reasons. Number one, Mordecai is jealous over Haman's promotion, since he himself was overlooked after exposing the assassination plot. That's number one. Number two, Mordecai regards bowing down to Haman an act of idolatry. Third reason, Mordecai has a clear sense of his identity as a Benjamite descendant of Saul, and has the courage to stand up to his ancestral enemy and accept the consequences of his action. Let me give you a couple things to keep in mind. These two accounts of Mordecai foiling the assassination plot and Haman being promoted would seem to support the idea that Mordecai was jealous. But also keep in mind that although, this, we have chapter 2 and then chapter 3, and it seems like it happened right after, there's probably a considerable amount of time between these two incidents. It could have been 4 or 5 years. Another thing to keep in mind is that when Mordecai is introduced in 2:5, he's not identified as an official of the court or a wise man, but as a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, why is that? And when Haman is introduced in 3:1, he is introduced as an Agagite. Now, I don't know if you know this or remember this, but the Jews and the Agagites had a perennial relationship of enmity. It's quite possible that the writer of Esther is highlighting the history of bad blood between these two peoples. Now, we know of people that have bad blood for generations. In our own history, we have the Hatfields and the McCoys, and it probably started over something small, didn't it? And in the Middle East, you have Al Qaeda. They would use slights from centuries ago and report them to the U.S. forces so that these people would be identified as Al Qaeda. For example, so-and-so stole somebody's grandfather's goat 3 centuries ago. And so they would report these people as being Al Qaeda and basically it was the Hatfields and the McCoys all over again. Had nothing to do with whether the person was Al Qaeda or not. They weren't, but they were reported as being Al Qaeda. We see the same thing in our own country, didn't we? Those of you who lived through the 1950s. If you were accused of being a communist, that basically stuck with you, didn't it? And it was really hard to get away from an accusation, isn't it? And we've seen this, when people are accused of being, wrongly accused of being child molesters. And it clearly didn't happen, but you still wonder, don't you? So, okay. Let me give you a bit of history behind all this. Keep in mind that Agag was the king of the Amalekites at the time of King Saul. Remember King Saul? We studied him if you were here for the Samuel study. The Amalekites were a nomadic people of the southern desert region who frequently raided Israel from the very beginnings of her history. They were the very first nation to try to attack the newly formed covenant nation after they passed through the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 17. God commanded the Israelites to eradicate the memory of the Amalekites from the face of the earth. Deuteronomy 25, 17 through 19.
True justice must be given to foreigners living among you and to orphans. And you must, never forget what the Amalekites did to you as you came from Egypt. They attacked you when you were exhausted and weary, and they struck down those who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies in the land he is giving you as a special possession, you are to destroy the Amalekites and erase their memory from under heaven. Never forget this.
Okay. Now, when Saul was going against the Amalekites, you remember that in the book of Samuel? If you might not remember that, but if you were in my class, you might recall that Samuel came to Saul before he fought against the Amalekites. And what did he tell them to do? What did he tell Saul to do? Anybody remember?
To wait on him?
No, not wait on him. He said, destroy them, women and children, everything, all of their livestock, destroy everything. Do not leave one man alive. Remember that? Which seems kind of harsh to us, doesn't it? But God instructed Saul through Samuel to attack the Amalekites and to totally destroy them and everything that belonged to him. Now you may recall that Saul disobeyed this order and spared Agag's life along with the best of the sheep and the cattle in direct violation to God's command. It was a direct violation of what God had told him to do through Samuel. Okay? Now, rabbinic tradition teaches that Haman was a direct descendant of Agag. Interesting, isn't it? Now, whether he was or wasn't is not really material to the story, but what all this backstory mostly does, while it might go over our heads, for the most part, when we read Esther, you can be sure that it didn't go over the heads of the Israelites who read it. And it likely didn't go over the head of Haman either. Here we probably have a blatant example of anti-Semitism. And once he knew that Mordecai was a Jew, Haman's pride and anger was turned against all the Jews in the empire. And since the writer of Esther doesn't give us any specific reason for all of this, we're left to infer that this ancient conflict between Israel and Amalek is the answer. Well, at least it makes sense, doesn't it? You don't just meet a person, or you don't just dislike a person, do you? I mean, I don't know. Have you ever met somebody and you just dislike the person immediately? I have. I mean, I said, well, this guy's really a jerk, Of course, I know you wouldn't do this, but I'm very discerning. But anyway, that makes sense. And so, he wants to get rid of the Jews. Okay, so Haman issues a decree of death against the Jews, and we'll finish with this. Haman is enraged. Mordecai disrespects him, and so he moves into action, and he uses an ancient method of divination that involved the throwing of an inscribed cube, which was called the pur, or the lot. And so he informs Xerxes that there's a certain people who don't obey the king's laws. Now, it may have been true that the Jews obeyed certain distinctive customs, even in Persia. You know, if you go to New York City and you see a Hasidic Jew, right? You know that they're a little different, right? But the truth of the matter is, it was only Mordecai who wasn't obeying the king. And then it was only with respect to that single command to bow down to Haman. Now keep in mind that Esther has now been queen for 5 years. And apparently she hasn't even told him that she is a Jewess. She's kept it hidden. Also keep in mind that Haman carefully avoids telling Xerxes who these people are. He doesn't say, we've got a bunch of Jews. He keeps them kind of anonymous, just, you know, this group of people. And, you know, we really get a bad picture of Xerxes here, don't we? Because Xerxes was too apathetic, and may I even add pathetic, to even ask who they were. And through all of this, Haman is manipulating Xerxes and playing him like a cheap violin. And it's almost comical, Gordon. It's almost comical.
Well,
So,
well,
yeah.
To your point about the enmity, we've already seen initially that in 3 it says King Xerxes honored Haman son of the Agagite, but then again down in 3:10, he says it again even more specifically and says, you know, so the king took the signet ring and gave it to Haman son of Hammedatha the Agagite, comma, the enemy of the Jews.
Yeah.
So he reinforces that anti-Semitic.
Okay, thank you. So Xerxes, he's being played like a cheap violin. Haman appeals to the king's need to replenish the country's treasury. Remember, the war with the Greeks pretty much depleted the treasury. Haman offers to provide 10,000 talents of silver, which would have been a very substantial contribution. That would have amounted to about 300 tons of silver. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian, the annual revenue of the entire Persian Empire under Darius, who was Xerxes' father, was only 14,560 talents. So, and this revenue was generated by receiving tribute, or what we would call taxes today, from the provinces or satrapies. Yeah.
Well, why wouldn't that be Xerxes' money anyway? I mean, Haman's not his money.
Well, but they would get this money from oppressing the Jews. It would come from plundering the possessions of the Jews who were killed. So this would be something extra coming in.
Okay.
So this is a new revenue source.
Xerxes is even more of an airhead in here because he says keep the money. Right? Finances don't seem to bother him.
Well, anyway, Haman informs Xerxes that it's in the king's own best interest. Xerxes agrees. He gives Haman his signet ring and his sign, which is used to sign and seal royal documents. Whoever possessed the signet ring effectively held the king's authority. And so Xerxes blindly allows Haman full authority of the throne to do as he pleases. And again, let me remind you that once the law was signed and sealed, it was irrevocable. You could not change it. You did not overthrow a decision of the king. And we see this in the book of Daniel, remember? Remember when when the king threw Daniel into the lion's den? He couldn't overthrow that, could he? He had to leave Daniel in the lion's den.
It was a decree, right? It was
The
an
decree,
official
yeah, you don't change the decrees. So, anyway, I'm done. Any questions or comments? We'll pick this up next week.
I actually do. I'm kind of curious about this. You said that they were impaled on a pole. Well, what about Haman and his instructions to make a gallows? Was that not accurate or what?
I'll have an answer for you next week,
Sure. All right.
or when it happens, okay?
Of course.
More confident.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's a gallows like we think of.
Okay.
Well, we've seen this, you know, where people's heads are impaled on, let's see, who did that in the ancient world?
David, with
Yeah, great.
Goliath.
Yes.
I'm thinking of the guy that they named Dracula after Count
Vlad the Impaler.
Vlad the Impaler. Yes, thank you. Having a senior moment up here. You ever have those? Yeah, Vlad the Impaler. Why do you think they called him Vlad the Impaler? Because he impaled his enemies.
And he impaled what they called the Swan. He impaled, when he became king, he impaled everybody who was the ruling class. All the husbands, wives, children, priests, nuns, they all got impaled.
There you go. He
Including the
didn't.
servants.
He did not discriminate. He hated everyone equally. All right. Any other questions, comments? Thank you for being here. Let me get a count real quick before you leave.